The family dinner had started like any other. The familiar scent of my mother's pot roast filling the dining room, the clink of silverware against my grandmother's china that only emerged for important discussions. Dad sat silently at the head of the table, his presence more decorative than authoritative. My brother Michael lounged in his chair, scrolling through his phone beneath the table, thinking no one noticed. I should have known something was wrong when Mom insisted we all dress up. "It's just dinner," she'd said, but her voice carried that artificial lightness that always preceded a storm, like the time she'd announced my parents were selling my childhood home. "Just a little change coming up," she'd said over pancakes before dropping the bombshell that they'd already signed the papers. Or when she'd informed me my college fund would only cover practical majors, her definition conveniently excluding everything I was passionate about. The dining room itself was a monument to appearances, crystal glasses that were never used except for these occasions, paintings chosen to impress rather than inspire, and family photos arranged to tell a story of harmony that existed only in her imagination. I'd learned young that my role in these carefully orchestrated scenes was to smile and nod, to be the daughter she wanted rather than the one she had. When she produced my grandfather's will during dessert, a document I hadn't known existed until that moment, the world seemed to slow down. My grandfather, her father, had passed 6 months earlier. We'd been close. He was the only one who seemed to understand my decision to leave a lucrative corporate job to start my own small business. "Following your heart isn't irresponsible," he told me. "It's the only responsible thing to do with the one life you have." Those words had sustained me through 3 years of doubt, through midnight panic attacks about money, through the disappointed sighs and pointed questions from my mother. "How's your little project going?" she'd ask, the diminutive transforming my greatest achievement into a child's hobby. "He left everything to me," Mom announced, her fingers possessively splayed across the legal document. "And I've decided how it will be distributed." Michael finally looked up from his phone, setting it down with unusual care. I caught a glimpse of his screen, real estate listings. He'd been planning his inheritance before the will was even read. "Michael will receive the lake house and investment portfolio," she continued, not meeting my eyes. "It's only fair. He has a family to support, and you." She paused, her disapproval filling the silence more effectively than words. "You chose to throw away stability. 3 years of building my business from nothing, of working 16-hour days, of finally turning a profit last quarter, all dismissed in a single sentence." But this wasn't new. Mom had always equated security with love, risk with betrayal. My choices were incomprehensible to her, and what she couldn't understand, she couldn't accept. I looked around the table at these familiar strangers, my father staring at his plate, avoiding conflict as he had my entire life, my brother already mentally renovating the lake house, my mother, iron-spined and certain, convinced her judgment was objective truth. The weight of their expectations, disappointments, and conditional affection pressed against my chest, making it difficult to breathe. "What about Grandpa's workshop?" I asked, thinking of the small building behind his house where he'd taught me to use tools, to measure twice and cut once, to trust my hands to create what my mind envisioned. The place where I'd first dreamed of my business, sketching plans while he told stories of risks he'd taken and regretted not taking. "That's part of the property," she said dismissively. "Michael will decide what to do with it." I looked at my brother, searching for some recognition of what that space meant to me. His eyes flicked away, uncomfortable, but unwilling to challenge the dynamic that had defined our family for decades. Michael, the peacekeeper. Michael, the designated success story. Michael, who'd followed the script perfectly. Corporate job, suburban house, 2 children, a wife who hosted dinner parties and volunteered at the right charities. "And what about Grandpa's wishes?" I asked quietly. That's when she placed her hand on the will and delivered her verdict. I wouldn't get a single cent. My response came from a place I didn't recognize. Calm, detached, almost peaceful. After years of seeking her approval, of trying to explain my choices, of hoping she might someday see me clearly, something inside me simply released. "All right," I smiled, though it felt more like finally putting down a weight I'd carried too long. "Then don't expect a single cent from me either." Walking out of that dining room felt like crossing a threshold I couldn't uncross. Behind me, I heard my father's weak protest, Michael's uncomfortable throat clearing, my mother's indignant gasp. None of it pulled me back. In my car, I sat motionless, hands on the steering wheel, breathing deeply. I wasn't sure what I'd just done or what it would mean. I only knew it felt necessary, like lancing a wound that had festered too long. The family pattern had always been clear. Compliance earned approval, defiance triggered withdrawal. By walking out, I'd chosen absence over submission for the first time. My phone buzzed with a text from Dad. She didn't mean it like that. You know how she gets. But that was the problem. I did know how she got. I'd spent my life translating her words, making excuses for her actions, contorting myself to fit the shape of her expectations. The exhaustion of it hit me all at once. 32 years of trying to earn what should have been freely given. I typed back, "I love you, Dad, but I'm done pretending this is okay." Then I drove home to my small apartment above my workshop, where half-finished projects waited for my attention. Projects that were mine alone, not attempts to prove something to anyone else, but expressions of my own vision. In the quiet of my space, surrounded by evidence of my own capabilities, I felt something unfamiliar stirring. Pride untethered from external validation. The next morning, I woke without the usual weight of anticipated disapproval. I moved through my day with a strange new lightness, focusing entirely on what was in front of me rather than on imagined judgments. When clients praised my work, I accepted their words without mentally discounting them. When a supplier made a mistake, I addressed it directly instead of absorbing the inconvenience to avoid conflict. "You seem different," Maya, my assistant, commented as we closed the shop that evening. "Do I?" I was genuinely curious. She tilted her head, considering. More present, less apologetic. Her observations stayed with me as days turned into weeks. The expected recriminations from my family never materialized. No angry calls, no guilt-laden texts beyond Dad's initial attempt. The silence should have hurt, but instead it clarified how much energy I'd been spending on managing their perceptions. I found myself sleeping better, eating regularly instead of forgetting meals during anxiety spirals, even humming while I worked, small signs of a self slowly unfolding without the constant pressure to contract. The nightmare arrived 3 weeks later in the form of a phone call at 2:17 a.m. "Mom's in the hospital," Michael said, his voice stripped of its usual confidence. "Stroke. It's bad." In the suspended moment before I replied, a shameful thought flashed. This isn't my problem anymore. But beneath that reactive surface, deeper currents moved. Memories of birthday cakes shaped like castles, of Band-Aids applied with kisses, of a mother who, despite her flaws, had once been my first source of safety. "I'll meet you there," I said. The hospital corridor stretched endlessly before me as I followed signs to the intensive care unit, my footsteps echoing against sterile floors. With each step, I felt myself slipping back into old patterns. Shoulders tensing, breath shortening, mind racing ahead to calculate what everyone would need from me. I caught my reflection in a darkened window. Pale face, worried eyes, mouth set in a determined line. The face of someone bracing for impact. Consciously, I relaxed my shoulders, took a deep breath, reminded myself, I am here by choice, not obligation. I can set boundaries. I can be present without being consumed. The ICU waiting room became my new reality. Harsh fluorescent lights, coffee from machines, hushed conversations with doctors whose expressions revealed more than their carefully chosen words. Dad aged years and days, his shoulders permanently curved inward, as if protecting himself from the next blow. Michael appeared sporadically, always in a hurry, always with an excuse about the kids or work. I nodded, understanding more than he realized. His life was constructed around avoiding difficult emotions, a trait inherited directly from our mother. The perfect house, the appropriate career, the scheduled family activities, all shields against the messy, uncontrollable nature of genuine feeling. "How are you holding up?" I asked him one evening when we briefly overlapped in the waiting room. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so like our father it startled me. "Fine. Busy. Julie's handling most things at home, but..." He trailed off, then asked, "How can you be here every day? After what she said to you?" I considered my answer carefully. I'm not here because I've forgiven her. I'm here because this is who I want to be, regardless of how she treated me. He looked at me as if seeing something new. I should have said something. At dinner, when she... It's okay, I interrupted, meaning it and not meaning it at once. It's not, he said quietly, but thanks for saying so. His admission hung between us, not quite an apology, but an acknowledgement. For Michael, always focused on maintaining the illusion of family harmony, it was a significant step. Remember when we were kids, I said, and Mom would get in those moods where nothing was right? How we'd hide in the treehouse and make up stories about running away to join the circus? He smiled, the tension in his face easing. You were always the tightrope walker. And you were the lion tamer. Braver in imagination than reality, he said, the self-awareness surprising me. We were kids. We did what we had to do to survive. His phone buzzed. He checked it, sighed. Julie needs me home. The kids. Go, I said. I'll stay. As he left, something subtle had shifted between us. A crack in the roles we'd been assigned, a glimpse of the people we might have been to each other in a healthier family system. On the fifth night, the doctor pulled me aside. Someone needs to make decisions, he said gently. Your father? He's not in a state to handle this. I learned that Mom had never completed an advance directive. The irony wasn't lost on me. She who had controlled every aspect of family life had left no instructions for her own. When I called Michael to discuss options, his response was immediate. You handle it. I trust you. Translation, I can't bear this responsibility. For a moment, resentment flared. Once again, I was the one managing crisis while Michael maintained his comfortable distance. But the feeling passed quickly, replaced by unexpected compassion. The family patterns that had shaped me had shaped him too, just differently. His avoidance wasn't callousness, it was self-preservation. Okay, I said, but we need to talk daily about what's happening. Real conversations, Michael. His hesitation was palpable. I'll try. It wasn't much, but it was more honesty than we'd managed in years. The next morning, I sat beside my mother's bed, watching machines breathe for her. Her face, normally animated with judgment or determination, looked strangely peaceful. I took her hand, something I hadn't done voluntarily in years. I'm angry at you, I whispered, knowing she couldn't hear me. I'm angry, and I love you, and I don't know how to reconcile those things. The monitors beeped steadily, indifferent to my confession. I'll take care of everything, I promised. Not because I want anything from you. Not because I'm trying to prove something, but because it's what needs to be done. That evening, I made the first of many difficult decisions, authorizing a procedure that might help, might not, but gave her a chance. I signed papers, listened to explanations of risks and benefits, and became the advocate she would have wanted for herself. Walking to my car afterward, exhaustion pulled at every cell. I called the one person who might understand. Tara, my best friend since college, the one who'd loaned me startup money when banks wouldn't, who'd held me through my darkest doubts. You're doing the right thing, she said after I explained. Am I? I wasn't sure anymore. Or am I just falling back into old patterns, taking responsibility, being the good daughter even when it costs me everything? Listen to me, Tara's voice grew firm. There's a difference between doing something out of obligation and doing it from choice. You're choosing this. That's not a pattern. That's growth. Her words followed me home, nestling into the spaces where certainty had crumbled. As I prepared for bed, I caught myself in an old habit, mentally cataloging what I'd done wrong that day, where I'd fallen short. But now I recognized it for what it was. My mother's voice internalized, the critical eye I'd turned on myself when hers wasn't available. Enough, I said aloud to the empty room. I did my best today. That's all anyone can do. The simple affirmation felt foreign on my tongue, but I repeated it until I fell asleep. The weeks that followed taught me more about myself than the previous 32 years combined. I arranged for the best care possible, using my business's emergency fund to cover what insurance wouldn't. I took temporary leave from work to coordinate with doctors, therapists, home health agencies. I methodically sorted through her financial documents, discovering a mess of disorganized records and unpaid bills hidden beneath her carefully maintained appearance of control. In her home office, surrounded by evidence of her imperfect humanity, I found a drawer filled with every card, letter, and school project I'd ever given her. Next to my amateur artwork and childish poems were newspaper clippings about my business opening, a profile feature in a local magazine I didn't know she'd seen. She'd kept everything, silent witnesses to a pride she'd never expressed aloud. The discovery left me sitting on her office floor, surrounded by fragments of a relationship I'd never fully understood. The mother who couldn't tell me she was proud had nevertheless preserved every possible record of my existence. The woman who dismissed my business had saved evidence of its success. What did it mean to love someone so deeply and yet so incompletely? To cherish their accomplishments privately while criticizing them publicly? Dad moved through these days like a ghost, unable to process that the woman who had directed every aspect of his life for 40 years might never give another instruction. Michael called daily but visited rarely, always with an emotional distance that felt both familiar and newly painful. I found myself in the strange position of managing not just Mom's care, but the emotional fallout around me. Dad's helplessness, Michael's avoidance, and my own complex tangle of resentment and duty created a web I navigated by instinct more than design. "You don't have to do all this," Dad said one evening as I organized medication schedules. "Especially after, well, you know." "I know," I replied, surprised to find I meant it. "I'm not doing it for her approval anymore. I'm doing it because it's who I am." The revelation settled into me like a foundation stone, solid, immovable. I wasn't caring for my mother to prove her wrong or to earn what she had withheld. I was doing it because compassion wasn't conditional, even when love was complicated. This understanding freed something in me. I began to set boundaries, leaving the hospital at reasonable hours to tend to my own needs, delegating tasks to a reluctant Michael, insisting Dad see a therapist for his own depression. To my surprise, the world didn't collapse when I prioritized myself alongside others. 3 months after her stroke, Mom began to speak again, halting words, often frustrated by what her mind knew and her mouth couldn't say. The first clear sentence she managed shocked us both. "I was wrong," she said, her right hand trembling as she reached for mine. I waited, giving her the time she needed to find words. "Always thought, protecting you, from disappointment." Her eyes, clearer than they'd been in weeks, held mine. "Wanted security for you, but I was afraid." "Afraid of what, Mom?" "Of you, being braver than me." The simplicity of her admission cracked something open between us. Not forgiveness, exactly, but a fissure where light could begin to enter. "I spent my whole life trying to be what you wanted," I said softly. She shook her head slowly. "Wanted you to be safe, not like me." "Like you how?" A long pause as she gathered strength. "Dreamed of, own business, too scared, stayed safe, resented, everyone." I sat back, recalibrating 32 years of understanding in an instant. The mother I thought wanted to control me had been trying, in her broken, misguided way, to protect me from her own regrets. It didn't excuse the hurt she'd caused, the ways she'd diminished me, the conditional love she'd offered. But it complicated my neat narrative of villain and victim, replacing it with something messier but ultimately more human. Two flawed people doing their best with the emotional tools they had. On the drive home that night, tears blurred the streetlights into halos. Not tears of forgiveness or reconciliation. Those would come later, if at all. But tears of release. The story I told myself about my mother, about myself, about our relationship, wasn't the whole truth. And in that gap between narrative and reality lay the possibility of something new. The recovery was neither linear nor complete. There were days of progress followed by setbacks, moments of connection interrupted by her lingering tendency toward control. But something fundamental had shifted between us, a mutual recognition that had been impossible before. As she grew stronger, I returned to work part-time, balancing caregiving with the business that had become more successful in my absence than I'd expected. My assistant, promoted to interim manager, had found efficiencies I'd missed and landed 2 major clients. "Maybe you should consider a permanent promotion for her," Mom suggested during one of our now regular lunch visits, her speech clearer but still deliberate. I raised an eyebrow. "You think I should delegate more?" A small smile. "Control isn't the same as strength. Learned too late." "Not too late," I said, reaching for her hand. "Just in a different timeline than you planned." That evening, I called Michael, something I'd been doing more regularly. Our conversations, once perfunctory, had gradually expanded into real communication. Mom suggested I give Maya more authority at work, I told him, still surprised. He laughed. Next, she'll be telling Dad to take tango lessons. Actually, I grinned, she mentioned a senior center dance class last week. Our shared laughter felt like reclaiming something long lost. Listen, he said, suddenly serious. I've been thinking about Grandpa's workshop. I know how much it means to you. Michael, you don't have to. Yes, I do, he interrupted. I should have spoken up that night. I knew it was wrong. We were all playing our assigned roles, I said. You were the golden child, I was the rebel, Mom was the director, Dad was the audience. When did you get so wise? He asked, only half joking. Somewhere between bankruptcy fears and bedpans, I replied. Turns out crisis is clarifying. 6 months after her stroke, I brought the business's quarterly reports to her room in the rehabilitation center, not seeking approval but offering connection. 30% growth, she said, slowly turning pages with her good hand. Impressive. We found a niche that no one else was serving, I explained. Took a risk that paid off. A smile, lopsided from her partial paralysis but genuine, spread across her face. Like your grandfather. Always saw opportunities others missed. That night, I cried in my car before driving home, not from sadness, but from the release of a tension I'd carried for so long I'd forgotten it wasn't part of me. The day Mom moved back home into the first floor of the house now modified for her limited mobility, I helped arrange her new bedroom. As I unpacked her things, I found a journal, open as if she'd intended me to see it. Inside were halting entries from her rehabilitation days, each showing progress in her handwriting as well as her thinking. One page caught my eye. Always thought love meant keeping them safe. Used money, security as control. Wrong kind of love. Selfish love. Must let go to truly love. I closed the journal, placing it respectfully on her nightstand. When she wheeled into the room, I didn't mention finding it. It's not exactly how you had it before, I said, gesturing to the rearranged furniture. Maybe that's good, she replied. Time for new arrangements. A year after the dinner that had severed us, we gathered again, this time in Mom's modified dining room with her wheelchair at the head of the table. The hierarchy had shifted, the dynamics rewired. Michael handed me an envelope before we sat down. Mom asked me to give you this, he said, uncharacteristically solemn. Inside was a deed to Grandpa's workshop, the small building behind his house where he'd taught me to use tools, to measure twice and cut once, to trust my hands to create what my mind envisioned. Along with it was a note in my mother's new, painstaking handwriting. This was always meant for you. He told me so. I was too stubborn to listen then. I'm trying to listen now. I looked up to find her watching me, vulnerability and determination battling in her expression. Thank you, I said simply. She nodded, and in that gesture was the acknowledgement of all that remained unhealed between us, alongside the possibility that healing could continue. Dad, more animated than he'd been in years, shared stories about Grandpa that none of us had heard before, small moments of wisdom and humor that painted a fuller picture of the man we'd all loved in different ways. Michael's wife, Julie, once a peripheral figure at family gatherings, engaged Mom in genuine conversation about the physical therapy techniques she used in her practice. Their interaction, free from the tension that had once defined family dynamics, felt like watching a foreign film without subtitles, familiar elements arranged in unfamiliar patterns. Later, as we finished dessert, apple pie I had baked from Grandpa's recipe, Mom cleared her throat. I've been thinking, she said carefully, each word deliberate, about changing my will. The table went silent. Not out of guilt, she continued, but because I see, more clearly now. Dad reached for her hand, a gesture of support I couldn't remember seeing before. Michael and I exchanged glances, a silent communication that acknowledged how far we'd all traveled. Whatever you decide, I said, we'll figure it out together. No, she shook her head firmly. Need to say this. Money divided equally, but more important. She looked at each of us in turn. Want to say what I treasure about each of you, while I can. She turned to Dad first. Your patience, your quiet strength. Then to Michael, your loyalty, your sense of responsibility. Finally to me, your courage to be yourself despite me. I reached across the table and took her hand. Not the one that had once slammed down on my grandfather's will, but her weak and left one, the one that struggled to hold a fork or button a shirt. The one that had taught me that strength isn't always what we think it is. Whatever you decide, I said, I'll be okay. And for the first time in my life, I knew that was absolutely true. As we helped clean up afterward, Mom called me back to the dining room. One more thing, she said, her voice tired but determined. The business, your business. I'm proud, should have said, long ago. Those words, so simple, so delayed, so necessary, fell like gentle rain on parched earth. Not enough to erase the drought of years, but enough to make new growth possible. That night, driving home to my apartment, I realized the journey hadn't been about inheritance at all. At least not the kind measured in property and investments. The real inheritance was the freedom I'd claimed to define myself beyond the confines of family expectation. The real legacy was learning that healing doesn't require perfection, only willingness. I pulled into the parking lot of my workshop, looking up at the simple sign bearing my company's name. In the morning, I would walk through those doors as the person I had fought to become, not in spite of my family's brokenness, but through it. The journey wasn't over. There would be more difficult conversations, more boundaries to establish, more moments when old patterns would threaten to reassert themselves. But something fundamental had shifted, not just in our family system, but in my own internal landscape. I no longer needed to choose between loving my family and loving myself. I could hold both, with all their contradictions and complexities. I could acknowledge the harm without being defined by it. I could offer forgiveness without requiring perfection. As I unlocked the door to my apartment, my phone buzzed with a text from Mom. Workshop keys in mail tomorrow. Yours now. Always were. I typed back, thank you. For everything. The hard parts, too. Her reply came quickly, a simple heart emoji, a shorthand for all that remained both broken and beloved between us.